you mentioned all these different types of love, but do you think there could be this unconditional love? Like, and how do we know if we truly love someone?
In the material realm or the mundane realm that we live in and experience, it's very, very difficult and very rare to find unconditional love. Eastern traditions actually explain that it's not possible to have unconditional love, fully unconditional love between two human beings unless it's a spiritual connection. However, the closest that we can get in this world to unconditional love is classically, and I say classically because it's not always, but classically characterized by the love that mother has for a child. Because often that mother will go to any extents, and great extents and lengths, to care for, provide and nourish the child. And it's very rare to see a type or a strand of love that has that same level of selflessness interwoven in it. So moving on to the second part of what you said in terms of being able to truly love. So this ties in with what I also just said in the PowerPoint in the sense that to the degree that we can actually bring aspects of spirituality or divine connection or being able to connect with somebody not just based on bodily aspects or even necessarily mental aspects, but being able to connect them soul to soul, so to speak. To that degree, we can really experience a true or lasting love. I hope that helps.
Cool, so I've got two more questions. One is to the idea of dealing with conflict. Luckily, well, that's my committee wants to society enough. We haven't really dealt with that. But what is your advice with conflict from a general lens and then also spiritual?
Yeah, conflict is difficult. But it's actually different for different people. Like I have a friend who has a very different nature from me. He's very, very good person. Very different nature. So he loves conflict. Like he thrives in it. So he'll go out chasing it almost. And I'm the opposite. I'm I just want harmony. I just want everyone to get along. Okay, be nice to each other. All that. So I guess it depends on your disposition to conflict. But I would say that as we know, typically, it's really interesting. So in terms of team dynamics and team theory, there's the forming stage of a team. So that's when the team comes together. And then there's a storming stage. And that storming stage really has to happen. If that storming stage doesn't happen, they don't actually get to the stage of performing, normally performing. If you, and I've noticed that in teams, where teams are just too nice to each other, and they're all just on the surface, they're operating on one level. But after some sort of conflict, some sort of storming, and then they've got back together, they take it to another level. So conflict is not necessarily bad. I think that's the problem and that's my point about this discussion point. If you can build the relationships in the team so strong that you all can debate an idea so hard, Soros, you have an idea, we're the team, and you're really invested in your idea, but we don't agree with it. Then if you can have a really good conversation about your idea and you can be detached from your idea, then that is really powerful. Then the conflict goes away because the conflict is typically my ego versus your ego. But actually, if you take the egos bit out of it, now we're just talking about the advice or the solution. They talk about in relationships, it's not me against you, it's me and you against the problem. It's that kind of principle. It's we've got a problem here, and it's not my ego trying to battle for my solution versus your ego trying to battle for your solution. It's actually we just want the best solution. Here we're checking in on our ideas. So in terms of conflict, I wouldn't shy away from it personally. I would see it, but I would use it as a tool rather than to incite annoyance and frustrating people. To incite good conversation, good discussion, and use that energy in that way to then come out and be good. And there is an element where if you are in a trusted team, even if you don't agree with the end point, but you guys have discussed it thoroughly, then there's a bit of just getting on board. Unless there's something morally, ethically wrong with it, there's an aspect of just kind of getting on board and supporting the team. So and that's again another spiritual principle is that you have to leave your ego aside of it. And that's what I mean, spirituality helps with all of this. It may not be in every Harvard textbook, but it genuinely helps with all these things. How else? It's there's not really many non-spiritual processes that help you detach from your ego. They're all spiritual in some degree, shape or form. So That's what spirituality helps in all of this stuff.
So forming, storming, norming.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact order, but essentially you have to storm before you get to form. Like you get to that peak of performance, which is really interesting because you wouldn't think that, you wouldn't think the conflict helps. But that conflict brings people together more after it happens.
I think if we want to start off the discussion, we were thinking of asking you, if you had to explain God to a 5-year-old, how would you do it?
Okay, how do you explain God to a 5-year-old? You know, the thing is, I actually know lots of 5-year-olds in our schools. I think it's a lot easier to explain it to a 5-year-old than it is to explain it to a 20-year-old at university. Because I think, except for Avanti, of course, the education system at large somehow manages to squeeze out the intuitive sense, common sense, that we can have in our connection with the world, nature, you know, how we deal with and think about reality. So I know obviously I don't want that to come across as naive just in terms of our understanding of the world. Clearly we develop different faculties and levels of depth in which we think about stuff, right? So as we get older. But there is an intuitive level of understanding that a child has. So actually explaining God is not that complicated in the sense that it's quite natural for them to understand that in terms of there being something greater. Now, that may not be located in personal experience, but in terms of the example that they draw on to come to that understanding, where there's a creation, there's a creator type thing as a simple example, it's quite intuitive. So most children, and also when we think about God as we get older, we're thinking about it from the perspective of, very like a very complex way of thinking about God. Whereas for children, God could be a friend, right? I mean, God could be so many things that's much more immediate to them as opposed to something that's very far away and distantly located. I remember when I was in primary school and there was I don't know if they still have it, it's called News Round. They still have News Round, yeah? So I remember quite vividly actually, I must have been about 7 or 8. So I was watching this News Round program and this presenter was saying that they asked children from around the world about God. And they said that one of the things that they noticed, which was interesting for them as they were reporting it, was that when they asked children in the Western world, where is God? Typically they would point in the sky and they say, he's somewhere in the sky. Maybe this like Sistine Chapel type stuff. And when they asked children in the East, typically they'd point inside. So it was quite interesting, like how children, based on their cultural kind of situation, context, stories, etc., think about God. But and that's why, like from a Vedic philosophy perspective, I'm not a philosopher by the way, but from a Vedic philosophy perspective, God's both, right? He's inside and outside. So I think children get it.
Probably like the ego problem, where you see like Duryodhana especially, because he had been done wrong before, or he wanted revenge. He was very much like, okay, I'm gonna make sure that they suffer. I'm gonna make sure that they realize what they've done and they feel really bad for everything that they've done. And so it sort of essentially consumed him, and it led to his own self-destruction later on. So how would you sort of, like practice to control that ego? Or like, because I think everyone here has like, you have times where you have like the biggest ego. Your ego's inflated through the roof. You've done something well. Someone's giving you compliments. To not let that consume you and then lead to, self-destruction.
Yeah, ego is a really big one. And, what I've been reflecting over the past few years is that ego is actually just a form of insecurity. Like the people who think most of themselves in an arrogant way are usually the people who feel most insecure about themselves. So that's one thing to reflect on. If we're feeling egoistic, there's something we're feeling a little bit insecure about. So reflect on that. I find journaling is helpful. But what was the second part of the question?
I was like, so how do you sort of not let it consume you?
Yeah. One common version of practice is to remember where you get all of your abilities from. And this is a constant reminder that actually we can't do anything without the grace of God. If you want to call it God, or you can even call it the universe. And if you don't believe in any spiritual aspect of the universe, we learned how to speak from our parents. We learned how to read and write from our teachers. We are completely dependent on the entire world around us to even do anything. And at any moment, actually, it can be taken away. So that's one of the lessons we see from this story of Draupadi, is that Yudhishthira, at this point, he's the emperor of the entire world. And in one evening, he loses everything. So one of the lessons here is that at any moment, the flickering nature of this world is such that one moment you can be the emperor of the world, and the next moment you can have absolutely nothing. And we think that this is never going to happen to us. But like, has anyone's parents come from East Africa? Did anyone's parents come from Uganda? Yeah. Yeah. And you know why there was a mass exodus of Indians from Uganda? Anyone know? Idi Amin. So Idi Amin was a dictator who came into power, and he basically kicked out all Indians, and the Indians who had to leave with basically the clothes on their back. And they weren't allowed to take any of their money with them. They weren't allowed to take any of their businesses with them. All of their property they had to leave behind. And we think, oh, this will never happen to us because we live in a quite stable government and there's no humanitarian crisis going on. But what if I told you, not only might this happen to you, but it will definitely happen to you?
I'm running.
But it would definitely happen to you. Do you know why? Because we will all die. So at the time of death, you'll have to leave behind all of your possessions. You have to leave behind everything you love. And you cannot even go with the clothes on your back to once you die. You have to leave even this body behind. So I think this is a lesson to us that there's stuff in this world that we own and we use, but don't be attached to it because you'll definitely be separated from it at some point, just like Yudhishthira was.
Would you also say maybe, I don't know, like in terms of not having the most inflated ego, but having an ego to have like some sort of confidence?
Yeah.
Or like, and at what point is it like, okay, you're overconfident, you're stepping over that line. So like, just for like, to help yourself out kind of thing.
There's a great saint called Bhakti Tirtha Swami who writes a series of books called Spiritual Warrior. And he defines humility in a really beautiful way. He says, humility is not thinking less of oneself, but it's thinking of oneself less. So I don't think I'm like really bad and horrible and like lowly and like a straw, like all that stuff. It's just that you don't put yourself in the center. And there's a really nice dichotomy that comes with spiritual life, because Bhagavad Gita tells us we are a spirit soul, and the spirit soul is described to be 1/10,000th of the tip of a hair. So if you get tip of your hair, which I can do, it's like not enough hair. So if I the tip of my hair, if I was to split that into 10,000, that would be the size of the atomic soul. So yes, we are very tiny. In one sense, insignificant. But on the other hand, we are also very great because we are connected to God. So there is this amazing dichotomy that happens that you can think about when you're trying to balance those two things.
So essentially just like seeing the bigger picture, that like you're present, you're part of it, but you're not the world doesn't revolve around you.
Yeah. Like there's another example that is given about firefly. In the nighttime, fireflies are quite bright. Has anyone seen a firefly in real life? I've seen them once in Borneo, but they're quite bright. And the firefly, if it thinks I'm amazing, I'm great, when the sun comes up, is going to be humbled a little bit. So yes, we have our little light, but we also have to understand the bigger context. Actually, I'm not everything there is. And if you don't, then the sun will come up at some point and humble you anyway.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of like the most important lessons, to like make sure that you don't consume yourself and be all self-centered.
One of the things you talk about in your book is about this topic of chance. But intuitively, right, I don't know, I'm flipping a coin. right? Is it not a 50-50 chance that it's heads or tails?
If you flip the coin, it's a 50-50 chance. If I have a machine here that is perfectly configured to flip coins, and I can control everything in that machine, angle, spin, momentum, air pressure, all of that stuff, I can control for it. And I set it to flip heads, what will it be?
Heads.
Every single time.
Yeah.
Right? And there are machines that do that every single time. So where's the chance gone? Where is chance gone? It's disappeared.
Yeah.
Why? Because I have now control for the cause, the real cause. All you're seeing when you see the 50-50 is what I was talking about, the distribution. You see a random distribution. So you're then applying that phenomenon of observation, you're backwards engineering it into causality.
I mean, obviously there's loads of like relationships, whether it's like partners or families. Some they just get along so naturally, so easily. Do you think this could be like there's this like idea of soulmates or like kind of thing? Do you kind of believe in soulmates? Is it like there's love, sometimes like destiny, or is it more like free will? Is it how much you are willing to put in for that love?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's definitely free will, but there's also definitely, from the understanding of the Bible, into some essence, some idea of destiny as well. And there's a delicate interplay between these two aspects from the understanding of the Gita, whereby, depending on our karma is a term which means for every action there was a suitable reaction, or what goes around comes around, like the boomerang. And this can be positive things, negative things, devotional things, spiritual things. Not that the spiritual and devotional don't come in the category of karma, but the idea that of what you putting out, what you put out, and what you intend to be something that influences what then you experience in your life. So our karma, or our previous acts and decisions in the previous time or previous lives, may mean that we have certain aspects of our life where we can gain so much, or we can make so much progress, or there may be difficulties in other aspects of our life. So that's part of it that can be a slightly restraining area in terms of how we go with this whole soulmate idea. And on the other side, we definitely have free will. And for those of you that have heard of the modes of material nature, or know about the gunas, which are talked about extensively in the Bhagavad Gita, depending on whether we're operating on the mode of ignorance, passion, or goodness, and those, could even consider them to be like energy zones, sound as they're termed. There's much more free will in goodness than there is in the mode of ignorance. And these aren't judgments on the person, like just, we all have to experience some ignorance when we go to sleep, for example. Just as we often find that, after 9 o'clock in the morning, we're really into passionate activity because that's the time of day that's predominated by the mode of passion, and needs a lot of creation and activity and things, and effort to be made to do things, or generate things. Whereas the mode of goodness, just in terms of times of day, is predominantly something that we experience more in the early morning hours of the day. So just like there are times of day that may be more predominantly governed by these three areas, in the same way we all have, just as you have three primary colors and so many combinations of three, so many multiples of three, we all have a different biophysical makeup, psychological makeup, depending on the combination of these that we are drawn to or are attracted to. And the reason I'm bringing that up is that just to show that this idea of free will and it being higher in the higher modes, or like in the mode of goodness, isn't something that's simplistic, it's actually quite sophisticated. But the reason I'm saying all this is that actually there isn't a classical understanding of a soulmate in the Vedic philosophy, but it is understood that there may be somebody, there may be a potential for a certain person to meet someone at certain points in their life, and maybe windows of opportunity. And there may be different loves in a lifetime, for example. And hopefully one of those will be something that you as an individual choose to take forward and it becomes your soulmate. But it's not necessarily that, oh my goodness, I miss that person and now I'm never going to meet anyone again and I'm, doomed. So in that aspect, it's not there as a kind of definite thing. You could say that the real soulmate is the supreme divine. So the yin for the yang for each of us, which is what the quote by Rupa Goswami was alluding to, and Srila Prabhupada was also talking about in his quote, is that source of everything spiritual, that source of all happiness, that reservoir of enjoyment and pleasure, which can be termed by many names, but the Vedas often refer to as Krishna. That's the soulmate, but that's the you have those jigsaw puzzles where like they're wooden. I don't know if many of you ever played with them, or you have nieces or nephews or siblings or whatever, and they kind of just fit into the space. So it's a famous quote that I've heard said by Satchidananda Maharaj: we each have a Krishna-shaped hole in our hearts, and when that little piece is put in, then we actually feel, oh, I feel so complete. And in one sense, it really makes so much sense, because even common sense can tell us that no other human being or individual is really going to be able to satisfy fully that hankering that we have for this like immense amount of love, both in giving and receiving. But the source of or divinity is something that we've always been connected to, and we are part and parcel of. And this is quite a philosophical point. But when we are reconnected, which is where the term yoga comes from, which comes from the Sanskrit root yukta, to connect, when we reconnect with that, we actually feel this immense sense of satisfaction and happiness, which we can't really find elsewhere in the same way. It doesn't mean that we don't need human relationships, of course we do, but we also need this jigsaw puzzle.
It sounds like you converted PS leadership into something that was majority management, less so leadership, into more leadership, less management. If we think about like the ratio or something like that, and that ties in with Nidhi's question, which was, what other things would you say defines leadership from management, and how can one actually go through that on a practical level?
So my view on leadership and management is that management is quite a technical act, and leadership is much more wider skill, like wider piece. So like management is literally like, it comes from like factories. Like the principle of it is like like I'm managing a production line, or I'm managing something like that. You don't say I'm leading a production line. Like I'm not leading the Twix bars being made like thousands of, but you're managing a production line. You're managing output. You're managing things, and actually like, so management is really important, and like I do it every day, and everyone pretty much has to do it. But leadership is much more visionary, much more thoughtful. Like there's this conversation, I think it's between Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. And Steve Wozniak is, I think, the chief engineer of Apple at the time, and obviously Steve Jobs being the CEO, founder, visionary. And Steve Wozniak is like, what do you even do? Like, I make all the tech, I lead the marketing team, I lead this, I do all the hard work, so I do everything. What do you even do? Like, what do you even bring to this place? And then Steve Jobs says, basically, you play the cello, but I play the orchestra. So the point is, the leader is kind of bringing the whole thing together and taking people along on a journey. And the manager maybe having a specific component where they have to like deal with certain outputs. So leadership is like a much more wider thing. Does that make sense?
I think one of the ways we sometimes talk about like not being self-centered and coming back to the ego point is following your dharma. Because even though it's like it is yours and your duty, it still helps you see the bigger picture. But I think in this story, and I guess in the Mahabharata as a whole, it seems so contradictory. Like the dharma is like, as you said, like a lot of it the justification comes back to the Kshatriya code and like the whole war happening in the first place, but also in this case the need to keep gambling and to follow all these orders. So how do we kind of balance, I guess, like, in again coming back, if it's today's day and age, if you tell someone that I'm gambling away all my money because this is my duty, like it's probably gonna judge you a bit. But yeah, how do we kind of balance that in terms of just doing our duty without thinking about the consequences too much, but also following like what our moral code is?
And the Mahabharata is basically full of what we call dharma sangat, where you have one dharma that's contradicting with another dharma of yours. And just to clarify, Yudhishthira has a dharma or a duty to never refuse a challenge. But there is no duty for him to carry on gambling as he did, nor is there a duty for him to, stake his own wife. Because at that point, your bigger dharma is of protection, or protecting those who are vulnerable and those who are under your care. So the Mahabharata really is there to illustrate that if you are just going by material dharma, it's really difficult to figure out what's right and wrong. And I skipped this, but if you read the Mahabharata, actually, when Draupadi comes into the hall, there's a huge conversation about what's right and what's wrong, and no one can figure it out. Even Vidur, who's an incarnation of Dharmaraj, can't figure it out. It doesn't say much. Bhishma is like, I don't know how to rule on this because there's this, but there's also this. And this is an example of something called Niyamagraha, where they're all sticking to the letter of the law, but they're forgetting the spirit of it. And the Mahabharata is really there to teach us that material dharma is so complex and subtle that if we're trying to navigate it ourselves, we're never going to get it right. So the best way is, instead of trying to navigate the material world, is to transcend the material world and work in the spiritual plane, and that will actually help us. The example that I love to give in relation to this is, anyone ever seen like a really, maybe I've said this before at KCSOC, a really tall building? What's the tallest building you've seen? The Shard. When you're standing at the bottom of the Shard, how big does it look? And when you're flying over it in an aeroplane, how big does it look? Tiny. And in the same way, when we're trying to navigate material dharma, what's right, what's wrong, it's like being on the ground. But spirituality, and when we chant the Maha Mantra, it's like getting on an aeroplane, raising our consciousness, and then it doesn't change all the problems you have. They still exist, but you can see them with the proper perspective, and you know how to navigate them because you have a spiritual perspective. You transcended them instead of trying to navigate them. So that's the value of spiritual life.
So do you think, like, in the generation we live in, like kind of in Kali Yuga and stuff, we're moving away from having, or do we still have material dharma to some extent? And I guess, like, how do we figure out what that is? Or should the focus be more on a spiritual dharma, which kind of, from what you're saying, sounds like it's a more common thing, that it's like much more similar for all of us rather than everyone having an individual dharma?
Well, everybody does have a material dharma in terms of what you do with your life. So there's something called varnashram dharma, which is your varna, meaning like what job do you do, and we all have different dharma. So I'm a teacher, so my dharma is to educate. And I should follow that. And if I'm a policeman, my dharma is to protect. So we should follow our day-to-day dharma because that is actually what gives us meaning, purpose, and actually can bring us to a spiritual platform. And then we also have our dharma within our ashram. So parents have a certain duty to protect their children and to look after them. So everybody in their life has different duties according to where you are in your life. So that's your material dharma. But the point of the material dharma is to help you to get to a stable platform so you can practice spiritual life properly. And you should never forget your spiritual dharma. Your spiritual dharma is essentially to reconnect with the source of all things. So your material dharma is supposed to basically fit around that as a jigsaw and help the main spiritual dharma. And in that case, everything works quite nicely all together, if you remember your main point.